claim. Anyway, the readjustment of U.S. policy because of the growing conflict with Iran has kind of put an end to this democratization program, in part because the United States has now divided the region up between stabilizers that include Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, and extremists that include Iran and its poodles, you know, Syria, Hamas, and Hezbollah. Okay, enough about that. Let me turn to another part of the world. The diversion of assets and attention from Afghanistan and Pakistan by the war in Iraq has led to the reconstitution of a damaged al-Qaeda leadership. Al-Qaeda links have now been shown, as I just stated, to serious attacks or conspiracies in the U.S. and U.K. And the ability of Al-Qaeda to create new networks, its deliberate strategy of focusing on Europe, its capacity to turn the crank on complex, potentially disastrous attacks is ominous. The return of Al-Qaeda is perhaps the clearest indication of strategic failure in the war on terrorism. Another worrisome factor is the apparent inability of the U.S. to grasp the danger. That's a strong statement. The inability of the U.S. to process the danger, because I think many people do understand it. But there is a cognitive failure, I think, here, and it's reflected in domestic, foreign, and defense policy. In the domestic policy arena, aggressive policing, indiscriminate use of immigration law, absence of effective intelligence gathering at home, rise of evangelical anti-Islamic rhetoric, and the apparent indifference to Muslim concerns in Washington combine to alienate Muslim Americans who support American needs in the wider ongoing struggle with jihadism. At the same time, incapacities within the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, for those of you who haven't heard of it, and the Department of Homeland Security, for those of you who wish you'd never heard of it, raise serious questions about America's defenses, even as Al-Qaeda reconstitutes. The controversy over surveillance has, been a problem as well, because if this is the long war that the administration asserts that it is, and I think many of us would probably agree with that assessment, public confidence in the sobriety and probity of the any administration's approach to these problems, and especially the civil liberties dimension, will be important, and to abandon that trust or to alienate Americans on this score is not a great idea. Now, of course, the implicit question in this segment of my presentation is, well, who's really in charge of keeping Muslim Americans on board? And the U.S. government is not organized to do that. And the British faced a very similar problem. They created 2 or 3 years ago a program called Operation Contest. And Operation Contest was supposed to have 2 dimensions to it. The one was to find terrorists where they were, disrupt their plots, and break up their cells, and so forth. But there was another dimension, which was a hearts and minds dimension. And the Cabinet Office couldn't figure out whom to give this to, because the British government is simply not organized to do this. It's a simple problem of, administrative structure. Whose belly button are you going to press on this at cabinet meetings? As a default, they gave it to MI5, which, didn't work out well, perhaps for reasons, we can imagine. Well, in the United States, we have that same problem. The U.S. government is simply not structured for this sort of thing, and there isn't the executive leadership. What's happening now in the United States is that local police jurisdictions are beginning to take these things seriously and act on their own to establish strong ties to Muslim communities within their areas of responsibility. In defense policy, the U.S. continues to militarize its response to the challenge of jihadism. To some extent, evidence on this point is difficult to interpret because the uniformed services naturally justify their procurement and force planning on the basis of counterterrorism, since this is, after all, the currency of the day in Congress and among the wider public. yet a massive buildup of U.S. Special Forces with expansive and seemingly, at least to me, fantastic visions of their utility against the jihadist threat is in the cards. In fact, the numbers, I wrote them up here. They're really worth going over. If I can just, I beg your indulgence for another 30 seconds. In 2005, the defense budget gave SOCOM, the Special Operations Command, another $25 million a year, which is not a lot of money, but I'm raising this particular point because it's money that would otherwise have gone to CIA to do the same thing. So a lot of these missions are shifting from the intelligence community to the Defense Department. The Special Operations Command troop strength has been expanded and its budget increased by 81% since 2001. Personnel levels are expected to grow by 15%, that's 3,000 in the next 5 years, and DoD, the Department of Defense, plans to add $9 billion to the SOCOM budget during that same period. These are extraordinary increases for that part of the Defense Department. Anyway, a better special operations capability is undoubtedly useful in the war on terrorism. I'm not saying it's completely pointless, and it's useful more generally in counterinsurgency campaigns. And also, some of this weaponry is good too. You look at the use of Predator, for example, to kill Al-Qaeda people in Yemen a couple of years ago. Well, it was more than a couple of years ago, about 4 years ago. It was also a good idea. Anyway, the scale of current plans and assumptions about the utility of military force suggests that the U.S. still misapprehends the threat it faces. The obtuseness I'm describing is highlighted, in my view, by the comparatively puny funding increases for public diplomacy, training, and recruitment of foreign service officers and other civilians who might be more directly helpful in winning hearts and minds and in the budget for foreign assistance. And I've got the numbers and we can talk about them afterwards. Few people believe that foreign aid is any more of a magic bullet than political reform, least of all myself, but there is little doubt that on the margin it can affect attitudes towards the U.S. in a way that weakens the appeal of jihad. In the domain of foreign policy, the U.S. has let slip opportunities to improve its image and undermine the jihadist narrative. The failure to intervene diplomatically during last summer's Israel-Hezbollah war and the declared policy of strangling the democratically elected Hamas government and the Palestinian Authority are two examples of this tendency. The apparent endorsement of and willingness to exploit a Sunni-Shia split in the Muslim world is another. No doubt these are complex issues that present few good options to policymakers, yet the failure to see them through the lens of the real war on terrorism, as opposed to the chimerical one constructed by key officials in the administration, and to treat them as opportunities was and remains disconcerting. Pakistan is probably the biggest foreign policy failure that is relevant to the war on terrorism. This is a very tough one. What the Bush administration is facing now are problems that the Clinton administration faced in its day. It's a very, very tough problem, but it's key, and there are no good ideas for dealing with the problem coming out of Washington. Finally, the 24 effect bodes ill. I'm referring to the TV show. The clever advocacy of torture and this popular Fox television program, now in its 6th season, has engendered a generation of young military officers who equate torture with patriotism. The U.S. Military Academy is now struggling with this and exploring curricular innovations to counter the trend. The celebration of torture threatens to hurt Americans at home, while it further undercuts America's reputation abroad, especially in societies that have abandoned such methods, like those of Western Europe, or where populations still have to fear it, as in the Middle East. On balance, therefore, it looks as though the U.S. will need to overhaul its approach to the war on terrorism if it is to regain the strategic initiative. It is too much, however, to expect the current administration to attempt this. No administration in the last years of a second term has the energy or imagination for serious innovation. I was part of one, and I can vouch for that. A looming election campaign that will focus on the war on terrorism and the question of who lost Iraq will make major course corrections even more unlikely. Hopefully, the next administration can move forward on this agenda before Al-Qaeda moves forward on theirs. Thank you very much.
All right. How much thought is given to the question of whether or not the criticisms of American foreign political and economic policies aren't, in fact, the root of the problem? Does anybody doubt that the U.S. is not obsessed with oil, for example? And with the prominence of the realist perspective in international relations for a long time, the idea has been that it's quite all right for us to pursue our self-interest internationally. That's our primary concern. So how much thought is given to the idea that maybe pursuing our self-interest has in fact had very detrimental effects on other nations abroad, and that we have some kind of responsibility to change those policies because there's something wrong with them?
That's a good question. Look, U.S. interests are going to clash with the preferences of people who live in the Middle East, almost necessarily. But that doesn't translate ineluctably, into conflict or the kind of serious contempt for the United States that we see now. Clever administrations in the past, both Republican and Democratic, have pursued policies that have, well, more or less intentionally been designed to sustain a favorable impression of the United States, despite the fact that U.S. actions were, necessarily carried out in self-interest and wouldn't correspond to the wishes and desires of people in the region. I think this administration is something unusual in its disregard for this factor, but I think it's anomalous personally, and it'll probably change.
Additional questions? I'm afraid you're going to have to come forward to speak into the mic. Sorry.
I was interested in what you'd said about the dollars, that $25 million that had been shifted from the CIA to the Defense Department. And I wonder, where do you get the most bang for the buck of where the money goes? Do they listen to what comes back from the intelligence agencies, whether it's in the Department of Defense or wherever? Because in my view, I see that this administration, and probably others, don't listen to it unless it's where they want to be. The critique of the thinking of where you want to have our country move should be, the intelligence agency is a very important part of what we need to have and to think, but I'm concerned, how much do they listen? And shifting money from one agency to another, why? Why are they doing this? Is it what they want? The answer's better from the Department of Defense than the CIA. Should have gone somewhere else.
I think some extent to the shifts of dollars you're referring to between CIA and the Defense Department reflected the dynamics of cabinet politics in the Bush administration. This and the fact that the CIA was certainly not the flavor of the month in Washington for those 8 years, and was seen to be more or less an enemy of the White House, not even a loyal opposition, but something more sinister. Donald Rumsfeld was the heavy hitter, so money and missions migrated in that direction. Whether that will be sustained in a new administration is hard to say. I raised this because of a broader phenomenon I believed it reflected, which is America's preoccupation with the military as the key to solving this problem. Now, especially when the problem is emerging in Amsterdam and London and Leeds and so forth, it's hard to see the utility American forces. Now, if you look at the way the numbers shake out, if you look at the DoD baseline budget of 2001 and its current appropriation, the U.S. military had a whopping 48% increase since 2001, while funding for the more diplomatic and public diplomacy things that I referred to has gone from $1 billion, more or less, overall in 2001 to $1.2 billion in FY 2007, which is to say it's remained flat. This seems to me represents a kind of imbalance, especially when one acknowledges, as the administration does, that all instruments of U.S. Power should be applied to this particular problem. Now, public diplomacy is not a miracle cure because ultimately, people infer the values of the United States from what the United States actually does. And right now, the United States is doing things that, in the view of the quote-unquote market in the Middle East and South Asia, don't seem to reflect values they share. So, that's going to remain perhaps a problem.
We've got time for one final question.
So just to ask about one specific proposal that's been made. On at least one day, Tom Friedman argued that an important policy shift that would both lead to moderation among the more conservative states in the Middle East and encourage moderation on the part of the conflicting groups in Iraq was $3.50 a gallon gasoline. Whether it's $3.50 or $3.75 or $4. You care to comment on how, if at all, that might be useful?
Look, I think fuel economy for its own sake is a great idea. It's kind of like when people ask me, well, do you think if the Israeli-Palestinian thing was solved, the larger problem of jihadism would go away? I say, well, on its own terms, it's a good thing to do. Whether it would solve things is another story. It will take so long for U.S. dependence on oil and Middle Eastern oil in particular to end that I'm not sure that it's a kind of a near to medium term expedient. And you have to remember also that there are a large number of people now who are motivated to attack the United States. I mean, and their motivations more or less have been set. They won't. They're not set in stone, perhaps for 2 generations, but for a while they are. And the U.S. is now a Middle East power. We've got about counting that there are 2 brigades of the surge that have now gone that are already in Baghdad. A third is on the way. So figure we've got 150,000 troops that are going to be there for at least the next few years. This is going to lock in perceptions of the United States for a very, very long time.
Again, we may have time for more questions for each of our panelists at the conclusion of all the presentations. But our next presentation is from Professor Ibrahim Karawan, who is the director of the Middle East Center here at the University of Utah.
Thank you very much. We have new batteries just installed to make sure that everything is going to work fine. I want to start by saying and elaborating on a theme that was mentioned earlier, but in a different way, which is to say that the degree to which certain fads get circulated in the American scholarship on Islamism is amazing, and the dichotomies existing in it and the shift from one end to the other requires that we would be both more critical, also more empirical in terms of what we are studying, and instead of looking for a general theory with great enthusiasm, it may be time to revisit Joseph de Palumbara when he talked about the importance of mid-level generalizations. And then we can hopefully move after that. But moving from a chaotic situation, theoretically and empirically, to general theories with great explanatory power may not be the smartest thing to do, at least at this time. Just to remind you, there was first the passing away of the traditional society in which religio-political movements were supposed to play gradually a marginal role, followed by, after Iran, followed by the line of the Islamism is not a relic of the past, but the wave of the future. Then, after 9/11, some people discovered and came up with this notion of post-Islamism. Post-Islamism. And they got tenured. They got tenured for saying that stuff. So it's very interesting. And then, of course, we have the war for the minds of Muslims and all of that. And the thing is based on a very thin base of, remember, those are not talking about a country or two countries. They are talking with about something called the Muslim world, or the Muslim mind, or the Muslim whatever it is. So my statement is a plea for scholarly humility on the one hand, and of what could be verified on the other. That's why I had the modest expectation of focusing on militant Islamic groups, which I like to call the MiGs, different from the Soviet airplanes that didn't work most of the time in Egypt, and I'm talking about in Egypt, and I want to link the two and say why and what are the conclusions and so on. I suggest to you, as I mentioned in the paper, that two major distinctions are important. The distinction between Islamic, Muslim or Islamic things, which has to do with individual redemption, which has to do with a degree of social reform, which has to do with narrowing the gaps between the haves and the have-nots, at times through philanthropic organization, and so on. And between that and the group that may be called Islamist groups, which are those who focus primarily on attaining power. Not in the same way, but on attaining power. That's why I always say to my classes that I came to the conclusion that there are fundamental ideological differences between my mother and Ayman al-Zawahiri. Because my mother never thought of establishing an Islamic state in Egypt or anywhere else, for that matter, But this is a fundamental component of Omar Abdurrahman, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden, Magdi al-Safti. I can impress you endlessly with my knowledge of names of those people and the groups they have. So what I'm trying to say is, and within those who want to attain power, it makes a difference between those who resort to peaceful and gradual participation in student governments, in clubs of judges, in clubs of university professors, in syndicates. Between those, on the one hand, even if you don't like their overall belief system, but there's a difference between those and those who resort to the explosives and to submachine guns and to the bombs and all of that. Any day of the week, you give me a choice between somebody who disagrees with my views by writing an article or a book criticizing them, and another one who would resort to what they call in Lebanon physical liquidation of the other side, I would choose the first guy. You know, so what I'm trying to say is differences matter. Lumping things together that way is neat and comfortable, and it takes the agony out of research, you know. But it is not a bad. It is a very important thing, and it is important to disaggregate, you know, those things. Because if you don't disaggregate, the challenge will become not only formidable, impossible to confront. The fear resulting from realizing that you are against, in America, against that many people who are out to achieve all these objectives, which doesn't exist really in reality, but that would lead to, you know, an attitude of helplessness, and it may lead also to a lot of overextension, something that empires engaged in historically from time to time. So, so if you want to benefit from the accumulated wisdom of this group here, and there's a lot of that, you know, then disaggregation is extremely necessary in that area. I'm proud to have had a chance to study with Robert Jervis at UCLA before he moved to bigger and better things at Columbia University. And Jervis used to say, don't waste your time saying that something matters. You know, this tendency in American social science to say, you know, do leaders matter? Do institutions matter? Do whatever this matter? But his argument was lots of things matter. Regarding most important issues, there's no single factor. The question is to compare the explanatory power of the argument that you deem most convincing with that of with competing, you know, arguments in that regard. So there are people who write something as if class structure factors are the most important thing in accounting for this, or globalization, or asymmetry of power, you know, along ethnic and national lines, and all of that. All of it is legitimate, and all of it could have a great impact in that regard. But the question is it instead of the role of ideas, which is often neglected, or is there some way of complexifying our understanding of these issues? I got in love with this term, complexifying, so I decided to use it on you today. So I you know, whether this is it is possible to do so. I go with Judy Goldstein and Robert Cohen with the argument that the issue is not whether ideas matter, but how they matter, under what conditions, and the best way to study their impact. We don't have the luxury of, you know, really deciding conclusively whether they matter or don't matter. Obviously, they have some degree of that. Let me say, you know, here with you the question of Egypt, and then I will make a few points after that. The study of Egypt in this case is not motivated by my sense of ethnocentrism as an Egyptian, but it is motivated by the fact that Egypt's developments and trends and currents of thought in Egypt proved for a long time, not necessarily the same level, but proved for a long time to have implications beyond Egypt's borders. So the study of Egypt is not the study of the Arab world, but it is a study also in part of the spillover effect of certain ideas given Egypt's historical role and cultural role. Hassan al-Banna started, an Egyptian, the Muslim Brotherhood, 1928. Soon after, the branches and became spread all over the Arab world. They were not agents of Egypt, or agents, but they were heavily influenced by the ideas of Hassan al-Banna. when the Muslim Brotherhood resorted to violence in the late 40s, a similar thing became like a role model of sorts to some others. When the Muslim Brotherhood established something called At-Tanzim Al-Alami Lil-Ikhwan Al-Muslimin, the international organization of the Muslim Brotherhood, that became heavily influenced by Egyptians. Most of the leaders of that were Egyptians. My fellow Cairo University graduate Ayman Zawahiri has been serving for the last I don't know how many years as the one-man think tank for a number of these organizations, meaning like the Saudi state hires Egyptian experts in development and so on. Egyptian Saudi terrorist organization hire Egyptian specialists in violence, so to speak. So I'm trying to say that the study of Egypt is a significant one in this regard. I don't doubt that Egypt suffered from a downward social mobility on the regional level during the last things, and they are not happy about it. Like most people who suffer from downward social mobility, they are not excited about that kind of move down the ladder, but Egypt remains in that regard significant. Now, Egypt had a relatively recent experience regarding militancy and violence, this stage between 1992 and 1997. But for those here and somewhere else who are under the impression that militancy is bound to prevail because of lots of structural factors and because of this, I would say it depends on the level of errors that the actors themselves commit and the state strategies in response. There is no inevitability, in that regard, and in many other things as well. Now, I will say a few words about that just shortly. I want to say here that you notice one thing in all the writings of those people, the leaders of these groups, Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, the vanguard of the conquest, I think it's called al-Fath. Another one that is called the Jihad Organization. The other one, Gundullah, the Soldiers of God, and so on and so forth. The other one, which was my favorite for a long time, which is called Those Who Have Been Saved from Hell, An-Naguna Min Nar. That was the title of the group. That you notice in it something similar, very much, to what people contributing recently to the field would call a literature review. Like the first chapter of a doctoral dissertation has this literature review thing. So they have this literature review in which they would say, Sayyid Qutb, this person advocated this, but it didn't work, and it's not really in full, link with what the Prophet said. And this one said this and that. Like a literature review of that kind, because ideas in that regard serve the important function of showing who qualifies for the role of vanguardism, who qualifies for leading the path. Is it Umar Abdul Rahman? Is it Osama bin Laden? Is it Ayman al-Zawahiri? And so on and so forth. Meaning there is ideological competition that takes place. Contrary to what many people think, the relationship within the bloc as a whole is not very smooth. Far from it. The fact that a number of people want to have an Islamic state doesn't go very far in telling us what degree of policy coordination or competition they are likely to have. And that's why, you know, these people, the struggle within the same ideological family often is more acute than the struggle across ideological families. If you don't believe me, go back and look at the Ba'athist struggle between the Syrians and the Iraqis, or the communist struggle between China and the Soviet Union, or between Romania and everybody else, whatever, you know. So what I'm trying to say is that it is not a discovery to identify that a bunch of people, you know, want to establish an Islamic State. That is the tendency to do that. But in the process, they are more vicious at each other. In prison, they would not pray after each other because they don't recognize the religious legitimacy of the other. And from the relative safety of Los Angeles, they appear harmonious. For some reason, I don't know why. But I'm just trying to illustrate the oversimplification of that. And in fact, good part of what they say is not only a denunciation of existing regimes, but a denunciation of fellow strugglers for establishing the Islamic State who are competitors over recruitment and over resources and over status. You know, that's a very important fact. We have to look at those people as they are, not as they claim, you know, at times that they are necessarily. And in fact, we shouldn't, I mean, in fact, some of their worst criticism was for each other. Think of the confrontation between these religious militant groups and the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood. Nothing decent was said in that confrontation at all, because it was the groups saying that the Muslim Brotherhood suffer, listen to this, of false consciousness, you know, that they suffer from false consciousness, you know, of it, and the Muslim Brotherhood, who are older, could afford to look condescendingly at those young people in these groups and refer to them as the misguided enthusiasts. I know some of you here may say that the decorum of exchange between these groups should be improved, you know, but I'm just saying that there is I enjoyed very much reading a document that got leaked to me some time ago from prison, from one of the leaders, written by one of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. It became after that, at that time I was very excited about having it and so on. But later it got to be a bit more known. It was written by Aboud Zumar. Aboud Zumar was a colonel in the Egyptian military intelligence, and it is called Hatmiyat al-Muwagaha, the inevitability of confrontation. He really must have made a tremendous effort, because conditions in Egyptian prisons do not lend themselves to writing without interruptions, things of that nature. So you know, that is definitely the case as far as I am concerned. I hope I'm not revealing any national secrets by that. But anyhow, the point I want to make in this regard is that this thing is on the web. The talk is, oh, okay. Okay. So he basically said something to the effect that, to the Muslim Brotherhood, guys, you ran out of steam as a leader. You want to understand things. Mubarak and those people will never listen to marches, legal appeals, you know, any peaceful thing. You have, the term that he used is you have to eradicate the regime in power. not to push them out, to eradicate in an uncompromising way, to have it. And the Muslim brothers came up with a misguided enthusiasts argument that I told you about before. And then they also basically said that this is not the tradition of the Prophet. The Prophet did not act, the Prophet Muhammad, that is. The Prophet Muhammad did not act against the infidels except, after 8 years of leaving Mecca, and there is a sequence of preparedness that doesn't start with military power, but starts with ideological beliefs, and then organizational strength, and then at the end it becomes possibly the resort to force. So in a way, I don't count very much on that explanation of what is the correct interpretation of the record of the Prophet Muhammad, because the record of Prophet Muhammad could lend itself to lots of interpretations. Anybody who lives for 60 years must say and do things that are not extremely coherent. So I mean, not identical in terms of direction, and all that. There were different conditions. He was sometimes in Mecca, he was sometimes in Medina. The imperatives of rulership are different from other imperatives, and so on. I believe that the main difference is that the Muslim Brotherhood had two other, when you were talking about what leads to moderation, two things. One is that they became much older, the leaders, and they passed through the experience of failure by being put in prison for 25 years, and the masses did not rise in the streets, which is a tremendous source of frustration for radicals, as David C. Rappaport said in his classes at UCLA. And then the other thing, so there's the element of political learning, so to speak. And the other thing is that they came from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and their socioeconomic status moved up the ladder. And like anybody, any people who have property, it tends to have a restraining effect from taking radical action. This is not an anti-Muslim Brotherhood assessment. This is, a general experience, in that regard. So I'm basically saying they have something to lose, and so on, and because they also know that the regime will unleash enormous repression against all those who are suspected or quasi-suspected of being Islamists as a result of the doings of the misguided enthusiasts, as they call it. So now let me just say the following. I want to submit to you for your consideration that reading not only the statements by these militant groups, but also looking at their actions, we may see 5 ideas. I take it back. Before the 5 ideas, I just want to say that they developed certain notions of bringing the regime down. The regime, as I say in the paper, but I will not elaborate on it, the regime is haiba, the state is haiba, which is a sense of awe from it. You have to strike at that haiba before anything else. Assassinating Sadat while he is surrounded by 8 intelligence agencies in a military zone, in a restricted area, is meant to send, in the middle of the day, 1 o'clock, is meant to say, we could get you wherever you are. Our long arm can reach you, which is not only Islamic, it exists in other terrorist organizations as well. The other thing is that the state is what they call mawarid. Mawarid means resources, extractive capability, not only coercive capability, but extractive capability. And when you hit tourism, Luxor, 1997, you undermine to a significant degree, not in a fatal degree, the Egyptian economy because of the cancellations and because of the spillover effect of all that. That weakens the thing. If with it you hit banks in the hope of making depositors take their money out in a hurry, then you want to create that level of unpredictability and tension and all of that, which is not conducive for economic development and economic growth. And the third one is my favorite. It is my, which is what I call cumulative provocation. And this cumulative provocation is an interesting one because, in essence, you don't do that to a regime and expect the regime to swallow it and look the other way. The regime would be committing suicide. So you do that in the hope that you will provoke the regime so massively, they act so indiscriminately that the strike will be to cause them themselves pain and loss. So the name of the game is, we are not here necessarily to kill you. We are here to help you commit suicide. That's the name of the game. Provocation is a very important component. I always said that if the United States responded to 9/11 by putting 300,000 young Muslim males between 16 and 22 years of age in some camps in Connecticut or somewhere, I don't know where, but you know, this would have been the thing that Osama bin Laden would have loved a great deal. Because hence he can turn around and say to his people, haven't we told you that America is intrinsically rotten regarding everything that is Islamic? It will be a verification of the correctness of the crude ideology advocated by Al-Qaeda. Where do we go from here? I'm submitting to you that there are 4 or 5 things that we need to study to understand the mindset, the operational code of some of those people. These are groups that are highly individualized and highly centralized. So it is conducive to that kind of study. They don't have collective leadership. Institutions are not their trademark, exactly. You know, this kind of thing. So what is it? That's the thing. One is the concept of shrinking time. You'll find that elaboration in the paper. But this sense of 5 minutes to midnight thing, the notion that Frank referred to yesterday about a sense of threat, real or imagined, and a narrow time frame, you know, that is needed. There must cope with it. That's a very important thing. This sense of urgency and emergency is very important to create a climate in which the absence of alternatives becomes the name of the game, and the need for action immediately. Our people, this is what they say, our young people are subjected to deliberate West-toxification and corruption by this emerging American culture and everywhere, and Western culture, and look at, you know, these things that we hear about, you know, dynasty and Knots Landing and the Love Boat, and all these things are nothing but part of a deliberate conspiracy to intoxicate our young people, to deprive them from their sense of identity, which is the worst kind of assault on the Muslim world that they would say. So it's important. That with economic subservience and political dependency and all of that, you have that image. We got to act now. And the second one is what I call the superiority of small numbers. I believe that it is true that they are small numbers. It's just they want to get the attention that is disproportionate to the numbers and the weight that they have, which is, I don't believe in rational choice, but it is almost a rational choice in in that regard. And it gives him a sense of elitism, because there is something wrong with you. There is something wrong with you if you are part of the majority. Yeah? It is. That sense is very strong. They are Leninists at heart. And I know some people, when they hear this term that they are Leninists at heart, they would say, are you part of the Western conspiracy to put Islam and communism in the same category so that we would? I'm talking analytically. I'm not talking about whether I'm saying they are communists or Leninists or all of that. But this notion of we are the select few who know what nobody else knows. This is Sayyid Qutb talking. Who know what nobody and who know how to move from where we are to where we ought to be. That's not a characterization. That's not something I would characterize as humility or relativism. It is something that has a degree of certainty that only the Communist Party under the Soviet system would afford or would have the guts to say for that. And then I would say, I'm almost done. Of course, it helps that in addition to that small numbers become strategically and tactically useful. Where are you going to go look for 19 people or 43 people in the midst of some millions of people? So on the one hand, those who will go that way, God will reward them very much for doing what is called غضبة لله, a rage for God, and they will not be that easy to locate given the nature of this kind of insurgency and all of that. The third logic that they have is the logic of shifting fronts. I want to submit to you, it is a waste of time to engage in the discussion about whether they are national or transnational. They are both. I mean, they tried in the respective countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and all of that, and the regimes cut them to pieces by acting under the notion that the worst kind of repression is a mild one, because it provokes your enemies without undermining its ability to strike back. So the Syrian example of repression is to say, you go for the kill, literally. That's what. So when they failed in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Syria and Iraq and all of that, Germany and the United States appear to be places where political action is doable. Until now, they still joke about the intelligence agencies in the United States, which were allowed those guys, some of them, to get in, to go write these checks for each for $25,000 to learn how to go up or how to go down. I forgot which one it was that they asked for, and then unemployed, in essence, and then leave to go to Czechoslovakia or Spain or whatever, and then come back and then leave again. Of course, in Egypt, this is not doable. Everybody who goes to the airport have to take into consideration that there could be a ban against, anything of that kind. So Egyptian security agencies, and they are hearing me now, in this, Egyptian security agencies laugh at the performance of their American counterparts, by basically saying this could not have happened here. So they shift. So the militants shift. They shift to where? They shift to a different setting. If Ayman al-Zawahiri, this is the last thing I want to do. If Ayman al-Zawahiri realizes that there is political instability in Egypt on a significant level, all the claims of transnationalism will wither away, and the Egyptian nationalist will emerge. Reports about his interviews when he was in the Sudan, he was elated because now he is on the border of Egypt, where possibly he thought he could make people make a difference. They do shift. They shift according to whichever the front that it is. But each of them, and most of them, would prefer to go back, in my judgment, to their countries, because the Prophet Muhammad preferred to go back to Mecca and not to any other place. That special place still has a meaning, where we are born, kind of thing, even for Islamists, contrary to some oversimplifications to the contrary. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to open up for questions. I realize you didn't get to your last 2 points, so maybe that can come out in our question and answer period. But here's our first question.
Thank you. I'll try to connect the two previous presentations, yours and Steve Simon presentation together, and try to make a conclusion why Egypt or the Egyptian regime was able to be successful in its war on terror, and why the American state is not going to be successful. First of all, the challenge that both regimes faced is similar: violent, directed against state actor. That's one thing. The response of the two regimes was also similar. They use of force, police force, military force. So the challenge and the response is similar. However, the surrounding or the context was extremely different. In 1992 till about 1995, 1996, the Egyptian regime, the legitimacy of the Egyptian regime was in its high days. This Mubarak has been for 10 years in office. The corruption scandals that came later was not known. He was generally perceived by most of the public as better than Sadat, as someone who got people out of prisons, more moderate. He bridged the gap with the Arab regimes that Sadat cut. On the same level, he also maintained peace with Israel, which was, most people agreed at that time, that was a good thing to do. So the Egyptian regime legitimacy was in its high days. The economy also was showing signs of improvement, stabilization at least. So it was not deteriorating. There was signs of improvement, which at least gave people a hope that in the future it might be better. So that's one. Look to the American legitimacy in the Middle East can't be worse. The perception of its support of Israel, the perception that, or actually the belief that support shores up the dictatorial regime in the Middle East, all over the Middle East, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, the images of Abu Ghraib doesn't help. So the American legitimacy is extremely weak. The other aspect is the information technology. In the 1992 till about 2000, internet was not that common in Egypt. The state and satellite news was not, Al Jazeera was not as influential as it is today. So the Egyptian state had monopoly over information that the society can comprehend. So it was able, at least mildly effective, to shape the hearts and minds. The United States doesn't have this monopoly and is not going to have this monopoly. Internet is providing an open forum for discussion of every point of views. The satellite TVs and the exploding blogs that play a critical role in shaping young people, especially young people, hearts and minds, is not going to help the Americans. I say as collateral damage. The collateral damage in the Egyptian case, the society was hurt. When they tried to assassinate the Minister of Interior, many people got killed in downtown Cairo, and the society didn't like it. Whether right or wrong, the collateral damage that Al-Qaeda is doing in the West is not perceived to be directly related or directly affecting the population or the Muslim population, the society that supports the regimes. My last point is regional stability at that era was I would say good. There was no major fights 1992 1997. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict was showing signs of improvement, which for those of you who study the Middle East or have been there, this is the critical, the central question for many people's minds. However, now the Arab-Israeli or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is deteriorating, it's exploding. So I came to the conclusion that while you might see some success at the tactical side. As Steve Simon said, in the long run, under the current condition, the United States government cannot win the war on terror.
Sure.
I'm sorry. My question is in regards to what has recently happened in the courts in Egypt in terms of the national ID cards and the fact that they're denying the Baha'is the right to be listed as Baha'is, and that means it gives the choice of the Baha'is to either break the law or to go against their own religious conviction. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about that. And in relationship to the Islamic movements or non-Islamic movements in Egypt.
Another question.
Well, as a matter of principle, I am against state dictation of how should, in that regard, in terms of action that leads to punishing a category of people, for being in that category in any way. I don't think that this serves any purpose. Whether the motivation was to please some in the so-called Islamist camp, but it has been a problem, an issue that is going on for some time under conditions of relative weakness and relative strength of this. It is the security agencies' perception that those people are not reliable of that kind, whatever the calculation was. But I personally, since the damage resulting from the web broadcast in my case is beyond repair at this time, I would just simply say that that this is not a thing that the Egyptian state should flex its muscles about, and it is not legitimate. I think that in many segments in the Egyptian society are more tolerant than the security services in that regard. But with regard to Mahmoud's important questions and comments, I cannot dare disagree with Steve Simon on anything that he considers major in his presentation. But I think the fundamental difference between the two cases is that degree matters in this case. So I think the figures in Egypt and the information about treatment. I don't want to get into the thing of is Abu Ghraib better or worse. All of them are bad, and I imagine the country that claims Lockean liberal credentials should perform better in that regard. And the other thing, that's not Egypt, of course. When I talk about that, the other thing that I want to say is that I think the difference is also in the scope. America's fight with terrorism is global. Egypt's fight with its terrorism is largely smaller in magnitude. Of course, they keep an eye on the returnees from Afghanistan. They call them al-Aiduna in Afghanistan. Then al-Aiduna in Chechnya. So there is a regional context, in that regard. But nobody has its targets, economic and otherwise, spread all over the globe the way the United States does. And hence, the criteria also must be taken into consideration that it is not a limited scope of that kind. Now, you didn't imply that it is limited. Sure. Yeah, no, sure. No, I do not doubt that at all. I think in Egypt's case, the militants lost in part, as you said, because in the street there was a lot of resentment. When you heard tourism of that kind, do you heard Mubarak and Gamal Mubarak and Suzanne Mubarak, or do you also heard the taxi driver and the person who was going to have the money to build a house from his income from this? So the scope of the impact in a societal way, and you got to give Mr. Mubarak the credit for seeking the advice of American trained social scientists to tell him what should be, why men rebel and what could be done in dealing with it and all of that. So he was able to make certain actions that came as a surprise to the other side. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, our concluding speaker on this panel is Professor Benjamin Judkins, also here at the University of Utah in the Political Science Department. He'll be speaking on globalization, social capital, and networked violence, the role of values.
It is, of course, somewhat intimidating to be the final speaker in such a distinguished panel as this, but I will forge ahead anyway, disregarding any warnings we may have had about the value of mid-level theory. By any accounts, terrorism is not a new phenomenon. Its salience to daily politics, however, is. Even a decade ago, most policymakers were content to see terrorism as, at best, a minor threat. Yet today, calls are heard both in the policy community and in academics for the development of new strategies to contain its growth. And you will notice that its is used in its singular form here. Yet before a new approach to containing terror can be drafted, it's first necessary to ask ourselves, what kind of opponents are we dealing with? Are they best understood as privatized appendages to state policy, something you might suspect from some of the Bush team reaction? Are they seen as international organizations, or perhaps more broadly based social or insurgent movements? In this respect, modern terrorism actually shows a frightening degree of diversity that is not always accounted for in our subsequent policy discussions. My hope is that, actually I'm not totally abandoning mid-level theory, that by understanding why it is that some groups adopt a specifically horizontal as opposed to vertical organizational structure, we can begin to point out some of the potential pitfalls in traditional strategies to contain the growth of terrorism when we misapply them across group boundaries. Now, Al-Qaeda and the current wave of Islamic extremism is what got most of us interested in this field recently, except for some of the old-timers that, we managed to convince to come here. And it's very interesting in this regard. Students of terrorism have noted that following the American reprisals in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda was basically forced to redraw its organizational flowchart. Now, there's some debate about whether that trend is reversing itself at the moment. But we can state with some certainty that whereas before they were a fairly hierarchical group with a unitary command structure, and they even had extensive fixed assets in some areas of the world like Afghanistan and North Africa, for a while, and maybe even to this day, Al-Qaeda now operates not in a totally dispersed manner, as some have implied, but more like how we may think of a franchised multinational corporation. It certainly retains a central board of directors, which is in itself hierarchic. And it even has how you would characterize it, a frighteningly sophisticated media wing that is very good at getting its message out, and by nature something like that is also, hierarchic. But we have also seen that it has been content in recent years to cultivate previously unaffiliated groups around the world, often through extensive contact on web boards and chat rooms that it runs, and to delegate to these groups the legitimacy to carry out and plan attacks that will then be branded with the Al-Qaeda imprimatur. And this may happen with more or less direct oversight and more or less funding in different cases that we see in different areas of the world. Now, this raises a number of puzzles for us, especially if we have a background in economics and political science, political economy like we do. Because if you have a background in economics, the first thing that you think about is, of course, the economics and business literature. And it's clear from that literature that once a firm has established a very reputable brand name, once a firm has a reputation out there, and Al-Qaeda is clearly a brand name at this point, firms generally expend a huge amount of effort to protect the quality, image, and ownership of their brand names. Nor are other agents generally allowed to use a brand name unless you license it, unless you pay substantial royalties for something like this. And yet these principles do not seem to be observed in the current case. In fact, it's Al-Qaeda itself which is making the often not insubstantial monetary payments to those who benefit from the use of their brand name, their training, and their technological assistance. Further, we were, at least for a while, being told by area studies and terrorism specialists that this form or mode of behavior was unique to Al-Qaeda, that this was something new that we needed to pay attention to. Indeed, we may need to pay attention to it. Now, Al-Qaeda's internal structure and system brand name management is fascinating. However, I'm going to leave a discussion of that, as Ibrahim said that we probably should, to those who actually know more about this subject than we do, coming in as outside interlocutors in this conversation. I would say that any MBA student or organizational behavior theorist who's looking for a good case study may want to look into this. Yet as I go through and look at what people are saying about this, it strikes me that while the details of how Al-Qaeda, both leverages and manages its brand name are unique, this general pattern of a central group with global ambitions franchising out the right to commit political acts of violence in its name generally is not. While not usually discussed in the same general context, this strategy has been employed in at least two distinct eras of modern history by a number of very different groups. Most recently, we have seen certain white supremacist groups and radical environmental groups employing this same general tactic of developing an easily recognizable brand name, such as the Animal Liberation Front or the ALF, and then franchising it out to a network of locally recruited, funded, and organized cells who maintain communication with each other and with a centralized leadership structure through an extensive system of web pages and chat rooms. In fact, this basic organizational structure was being used by many of these groups before U.S. reprisals in Afghanistan made it necessary for Al-Qaeda to begin to modify the way it did business for a while. Yet it would be a mistake to assume that it was radical environmentalist or racial hate groups who first developed a system of franchised or perhaps networked terror. Well, Al-Qaeda and ALF would seem to have very little in common by way of their ideological, let alone theological beliefs. Both can be thought of as a reaction to the problems and opportunities created by the spread of investment, trade, and communication technology. In short, the existence of both of these groups is bound up with, inexplicably bound up with, the phenomenon that we popularly refer to as globalization. While it is certainly possible to imagine some group killing in the name of God without the internet, it's not really possible to imagine Al-Qaeda or ALF as specific institutions doing what it is that they do without the internet or without globalization. Of course, most political economists and economic historians will quickly remember that this is not the only or even most far-reaching era in which globalization has emerged. By most measures, the period of 1880 to 1914 was almost as global as the world that we live in today. By some respects, such as trade in finished goods and labor mobility, it was actually much more global than the world that we live in today. You could travel without a passport in 1880. That is a difficult trick to accomplish today. We should not then be surprised to see the emergence of another transnational movement or set of transnational movements in this period, also reacting to the opportunities and challenges presented by changing economic fortune. The anarchists and communists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were no strangers to the idea that one could develop a reputation through acts of violence, spread your ideas through newly expanding and quickly diversifying media outlets, and then let others organize themselves in new markets to take up the struggle. Indeed, the entire doctrine of worldwide revolution that was so much in vogue at this point in time practically necessitates a networked or franchised approach to political violence, because you certainly aren't going to be able to get on a steamship and do it everywhere yourself. So we should not be surprised to learn that many of the current tacticians in both the radical environmental and Islamic movements today have studied the works of these old Marxist revolutionaries extensively. Again, not saying that ideologically these groups are Marxists, but tactically they have certainly paid attention to what happened in the past. Now, when presented in this broader ideological and historical context, both a new pattern and puzzle begin to emerge. It is at the points of greatest globalization that we see the emergence of franchises as a successful strategy for some, and I stress some, anti-systemic movements. Well, how specifically does globalization advantage these strategies? And just as importantly, what costs does maintaining these strategies impose on groups that use them? Because every strategy has costs and benefits, something that's also been missed from a lot of our current policy analysis. What are the limits to the utility of these strategies? If they give some groups an advantage in getting their message heard, well then why don't other groups, such as Hamas, the PLO, or the IRA, adopt these strategies as well? Is this simply a matter of historical path dependency, or is there a logic to the organizational structure that different extremist groups may find themselves adopting? Lastly, what can we as policymakers do to counter the spread of these deadly ideologies, or deadly identities, if you will, in an age of global struggle and instant communication? In our paper, we argue that while globalization is a necessary condition for the success of these groups, it in itself is not actually sufficient to understand their distribution throughout the international system. To better predict where franchised violence will emerge, we need to instead turn to the realm of identities, ideas, and beliefs that individual actors hold about what their relationships are like with their neighbors, with their immediate social group, and with society at large. Networked movements can only expand by spreading their unique norms and identities through already vulnerable communities. We ask what role a community's pre-existing stock of social capital or shared norms of trust and reciprocity can play in hampering the growth of certain types of extremist movements. While social capital and networks are often discussed in relation to a community's ability to absorb new ideas and new identities, particularly fans of democratization often point to social capital as something that you need to encourage if you want democratization to work. We believe that that's only half the story. In fact, social capital can have a deeply conservative character or bias as well. By imposing a substantial entrance cost to new identities, certain communities may make themselves less vulnerable to the growth of fringe extremist movements. In effect, communities rich in one type of social capital may actually be able to shade out the development of other voices, which is often seen as a bad thing, but may be a good thing in this particular context. This might go also some way towards explaining why different sorts of terrorist structures are needed to penetrate different sorts of target communities. Consider, for instance, the idea of bonding capital, something that we discuss much more in our paper, which of course I would advocate that all of you read immediately, where at any rate bonding capital are those links between individuals and his immediate social group, right? So small groups with tight links here. Now, past experience has shown that unfortunately it is not overly difficult for terrorist organizations to recruit, as we saw yesterday, lone or solitary individuals who have the best intentions, who wish to make a difference for their community, and yet they feel alienated and disempowered. My favorite discussion of exactly what that process looks like in clinical and excruciating detail can be found in Terror in the Name of God by Jessica Stern. Right? Once individuals are already atomized, they're relatively easy to recruit. It's more difficult, time-consuming, and expensive, however, to have to recruit such individuals if they are already part of a vibrant social group, such as, for instance, a local religious community or a local religious congregation in which they are well-schooled in the identities and doctrines of that community, and they see that community as being successfully engaged in the same struggle that they are engaged with. That sort of an individual is actually very difficult to recruit. In this case, the outside organization may view that indigenous community as a peer competitor and may say, well, the only way we can expand is essentially to recruit this entire group, to attempt to license to this group our identity or our game plan and get that community to carry on our struggle. Now, I think this may be something like what we're seeing currently with the issue of Shiite militias and Iranian support in Iraq, right? You know, Iran would clearly like to have more influence in what is going on, especially in the southern part of Iraq, and they'd probably like to build up their own organizational structure to do so. And yet it's very difficult to do that when there are so many thousands of local militias that are already running around with guns, clearly peer competitors. And so Iran has found itself in the more difficult position of having to try to recruit these groups to their sides through giving them weapons, through giving them money, through giving them technical support. Yet by imposing this additional cost to entry to those who seek to expand, their extremist ideology beyond their small community, what we essentially do is change the offense-defense balance between extremists and the rest of society by making the attack relatively more expensive to carry out, and at the same time using the institutions of civil society to subsidize our own defense. The best defense against a networked attack is a networked defense that by definition can only be carried out by civil society. And as the Iranians are finding out, it may be problematic to attempt to license your reputation or your goal to other groups, because while they're certainly pouring money into some of these Shiite militias, it's not really clear how much long-term political influence they have managed to buy with this yet. Now, this also implies that policymakers who are concerned about the spread of networked extremist groups should be very careful when crafting their policies to avoid responses that rely on heavy surveillance or other forms of state co-optation of social groups, as these methods can actually destroy the social capital that is, in fact, your first line of defense against an incoming ideology. Thus, the types of police actions designed to deal successfully with highly institutionalized nationalist movements, organized crime syndicates, and I expect that has actually influenced our response to terror quite a bit, or more traditional terrorist groups may have exactly the opposite of the intended effect when we try to apply them to more franchised or networked social movements. For instance, as many of my co-presenters have already pointed out in this conference, the single most important group of individuals that you have to have on your side if you are attempting to deter the spread of an extremist Islamic ideology, and I'm speaking only to them because they are what everyone else has spoken to this morning. You can apply this to environmentalists or to white supremacists as well. Are, of course, the 90% of moderate Muslims in America and Europe that want absolutely nothing to do with this worldview. We must ask ourselves then, what sort of target community would an external terrorist group wish to see in America, France, or England? one in which there is a vibrant associational life centered around the local mosque, dominated through statistical necessity by that, vast, relatively happy majority, or one in which the mosque has become a socially marginal refuge, shunned by many moderate members of the community. Now, patterns of heavy surveillance and the regulation of speech by the government can certainly impact the place of the mosque in society. What is less well appreciated is that much more subtle measures, such as the establishment of centralized programs for training imams, funding the construction of official mosques to replace storefront or backroom operations, and state payments to clerics, all measures for controlling the growth of extremist Islam that have been discussed extensively in certain European countries, could backfire spectacularly by destroying social capital in the Muslim community of these states and thus opening them up to further penetration by extremist groups. So how then is it possible that the state funding of a cleric could hurt a vibrant and fast-growing faith community? Because that is what Islam is in Europe. Well, basically in exactly the same way that European states quite consciously disempowered and hollowed out the mainstream or quote-unquote established Christian churches on the continent in the first half of this century. Whereas before, religious leaders were forced to compete with one another for their flocks, for their congregations, and they competed with one another through the provision of public goods that led to social capital formation. After the de facto establishment of state churches, religious leaders turned their eyes away from the local communities, who no longer ensured their survival, towards their new administrators, censors, and paymasters, the state. Now, given the state of affairs, church leaders simply stopped responding to social demands of the community, and it was no longer rational to do so. The denominational religions of Europe quickly began to recede as an important force in civil life, and the European state, which had probably intended this all along, stepped in to fill the breach. Now, upon reviewing some of the European strategies for dealing with the threat of extremist Islam, one gets the sense that they hope for a repeat performance here. They hope that by subsidizing local communities, that they too can convert them into quiescent actors who will adhere to state demands and then eventually wither, such as the much more powerful mainstream denominations did. And yet, given the amount of outside pressure there is, it seems unlikely that that happy turn of events would come about. The truth is, history rarely repeats itself so nicely and so cyclically. Yet in destroying the social capital of these communities, as I said before, we'll do something else. In addition to weakening their ability to deal with extremism, we'll weaken their ability to deal with lots of other problems as well. The truth is, radicalism is not the most important problem facing diaspora and European Muslim communities. That's just the problem that we here today are interested in talking about. When you actually look at these communities, what you see is often very high crime, poverty, drugs. In France, we see pervasive unemployment among young Muslims. Possibly up to 40% of young Muslims in France are currently unemployed. By empowering civil society rather than attacking civil society, we can not only satisfy some of our own security concerns, but hopefully we can begin to allow these communities to build up the capacity that they need to deal with some of the even more immediate and pressing issues that are affecting the lives of hundreds of thousands of their citizens on a daily basis. To close by returning to the remark of Martha Crenshaw, one of our first speakers, whose responsibility is it to deal with the problem of the growth of extremist groups in civil society? Well, ultimately, it is civil society's responsibility to deal with that problem. Government can take actions that can help, but, as we saw, there is probably no cabinet position, and there will be no cabinet position in the immediate future that is tasked with the oversight of civil society. Thank you.
Again, we have time for questions.
My question to you is that I believe civil society is a certain solution, but there is a problem too. And how would you make a distinction between the civil society that normal Muslim people want to enter into, and the civil society that extremist Islamist wants to establish in order to recruit, in order to find funding and other means? How will you make a distinction?
Well, this is an interesting and ongoing debate in the literature, because some scholars have said, especially when you deal with religiously generated social capital, that there's a dark side to social capital, that this can become very exclusive and very damaging very fast. Luckily, quite a bit of empirical work has been done on this recently that I have cited in my paper, and what has basically been determined is it doesn't matter how religiously devout the people in society get, right? Religion itself does not cause the bad side of civil society. The more active a group is in religion, generally speaking, the more bonding capital they build, right? So when you look at, here's an example from American life, when you look at people that are only marginally associated with mainstream American Protestant churches, right, they actually have fairly moderate levels of social capital formation, where they have some but not extensive bonds of trust and reciprocity with people in the rest of society. When you look at Reconstructionist Christians, right, a group that could be considered by some in America to be very problematic because of the very extremist view they have, of what civil society should look like, what we actually discover is that they have really high levels of social capital, including really high levels of bridging social capital to other groups. So it's not just the religious extremism in itself that causes the problem. The problem probably comes from, already existing political demands.
Other questions?
Hopefully this means you have all resolved to read our paper, which is excellent.
If there are not, I actually have a question, and I'd also like to invite the panelists to react to one another's remarks. We do have some additional time in this session. This is for you. In talking about social capital and what the state has done to quash the development of it, you don't seem to suggest that necessarily the state has to take a hand in increasing that capability. Why is that? And
Well,
you imagine there should be a role in it. It's a two-part.
Yeah, okay.
And then, in talking about social capital as a resource to combat against the infiltration of ideologies, you talked about these networks being civil society and created in civil society as this defense. If we're not part of that social capital because you're identifying particular groups, how does the rest of civil society then engage if the state isn't playing a role in this? Anyway, I heard your presentation.
All right. In terms, and again, this is something that we talk about more extensively in our paper, and I didn't really want to go into it in a brief presentation. There are two types of social capital. There is bonding social capital and bridging social capital. Actually, there are many types of social capital because this idea is discussed in many fields, and every field has their own topology, as it turns out. So in political science, we talk about bonding and bridging social capital. Bonding capital is that capital which you have with your immediate in-group members, right? Bridging capital is the bonds of trust and reciprocity that exist to other members in society as a whole. What we found in our paper is that both those bonding and bridging forms can be an important deterrence to the spread of extremist ideology. They work in slightly different ways, but you want to encourage both of them simultaneously. The other interesting thing is that just because people have more bonding capital doesn't necessarily mean they have less bridging capital. As I was saying before, often it's the people with the highest bonding capital that have the highest amount of bridging capital as well. In response to your first question, why I focused on actions that the state could take that would damage civil capital, because like our friends up the hill in the medical school, I believe in first doing no harm, right? And I think that we are in a situation, actually, where as people seek to respond to this terrorist or this perceived extremist threat, we are in danger of doing a lot of harm to communities that could potentially actually become important advocates for solving their own problems. I do think that there are positive measures that the state could take to promote social capital, and I do think that that would be an important thing for them to do. I would just like first to see the French government not eviscerate the potential for having a real vibrant Muslim French community.
Questions have emerged. Here's one.
I enjoyed your talk. It led me to remember the reputation that Hamas and Hezbollah have for also delivering social services to communities and doing so with relatively less corruption than competing groups and alternatives. And you could say that the United States had a grand opportunity post the military conflict to deliver social services in the reconstruction in Iraq, and we blew it. So I just wonder if you have any suggestions of whether or not that's a lost opportunity that can somehow be regained, or what can be done about that?
Yes, I think that that is a lost opportunity in Iraq, and I think that that is also a lost opportunity in Lebanon following the war that happened there. That there have been many lost opportunities recently. I am not, however, a contractor for the downtown Baghdad urban renewal team, so I don't exactly know what the state of these projects are. I have some students who are in the military and some friends who are in the military, and I get to hear about the results of their humanitarian efforts, which they spend quite a bit of time carrying out. However, it seems to me that we have probably decisively lost that battle already. I mean, I think what would be nice to see is if the U.S. government could use whatever influence that it had in the region to try to push for the growth of a less pathological civil society, though there are many people who say the long history of repression and then damaging economic sanctions and warfare in Iraq have made repairing Iraq's specific civil society an uphill battle. That is probably one bridge too far for current American policymakers.
There's another question.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out a lot of countries that have had it's on, I think. Yeah, in many countries that have been colonized before and had the state or democracy imposed on them, what's today called civil society is actually political structure from before. And so one has to realize that sometimes you have 1, 2, or 3 levels of politics going on. And this is not really civil society. It's highly competitive political groups who form a structure.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, there's another question.
Am I well positioned now? The Egyptian broadcast, hello. Excellent point. I wanted to take up your point and extend it. The Islamic Brotherhood, local organizations, Hamas and Hezbollah, as I understand, two extremely successful political organizations which promote and build on social capital.
Yeah.
They provide welfare services. I've seen people interviewed saying if it wasn't for Hezbollah, this is during the recent war, I couldn't feed my children and so on and so forth. And it seems to me we have a conundrum here, if that's the right word, because on the one hand we want these local communities to be vibrant, on the other hand the most effective terrorist organizations, more than terrorist, military organizations can be built by such organizations which can then win elections, for example. These are not fringe extremist organizations anymore. So this is where I think we need to be looking at understanding local grievances and understanding the local demands for autonomy and so on, and realizing, hold on, we need to be optimizing here, not maximizing our own interests necessarily, but actually building an optimized political system.
Yeah, no one can say a word against understanding local grievances. I fully agree that we should. I'd like to point out that that is a very interesting puzzle, and it's a puzzle that we do take a stab at actually addressing in the paper. I didn't, again, for the sake of time, get into it in my presentation. The basic idea, however, is this, that again there were two types of social capital. There was a bonding capital and the bridging capital, and both of them act as barriers to entry to someone who is attempting to come in and set up shop, in an area that they have not worked before. And they work slightly differently, all right? If there is high bonding capital, this may lead you to decide, okay, we need to franchise this operation out. We need to subvert pre-existing local groups and bring them into our social structure. If there's high levels of bridging capital, what bridging capital really determines is, well, how much do you have to pay these guys to get them into your social structure, right? If they had wonderful relations with the rest of society, if they had good relations with the rest of government, if there was a lot of trust and reciprocity, you're going to have to pay these groups. You are going to have to compensate them, in fairly robust ways to get them to line up with an ideology that is otherwise splitting them off of the source of good things happening. My sense then is that when you see a terrorist network expanding into an area with a lot of bridging capital, this is precisely when you see something like Hamas, because they suddenly have got to provide all of these social services to compensate, for the amount of potential conflict that they are about to cause, in this community. Now, that's an idea that can certainly be refined and expanded further. And again, the interesting thing from a policymaker's standpoint is, yes, groups can do it, and they can be very, very effective when they do it. And yet, that is certainly a more expensive type of operation to maintain. And if you're interested in the cost-benefits analysis, you would certainly love to have your other, the other guy have to maintain extensive overhead and possibly run some hospitals, as opposed to just being able to concentrate all of his resources on being able to get you all of the time. I don't know how many resources Hamas, sinks into their local youth soccer league, but it seems to me a good thing inherently that they have to sink some resources into a local youth soccer league.
Okay.
That they have a youth soccer league?
We'll leave the soccer discussion for lunch. How about that?
Okay.
There's one final question.
I'm interested in, in your concepts of branding and so forth, have you explored the concept of the international gaming community? Because that's a youth, it's a teenage market, young adult market.
By gaming, do you mean
market.
online gambling?
No, I don't mean online gambling. I mean, the games being played.
Oh,
Computer
like
games,
MMORPGs.
Internet
Yes.
computer gaming, okay?
Yeah.
Because obviously the internet is being used for a positive and a negative force in this whole issue of terrorism. Because the bonding international socialization fragmentation is going on rapidly now.
Yeah.
We don't see the numbers of people attending conferences anymore that we did 10, 20 years ago. People tend to say, well, I can catch it on the internet. People aren't going to movies.
Yeah.
But there is an international community of people who get together on the internet for various purposes, and one of them right now is playing computer games.
Yeah.
That's anyhow, just like hear your comments.
That is a very, very interesting question. One of the things that I have wanted to do for a long time, and I don't know whether my co-author would be interested in joining me in this venture or not, would be to set up an online role-playing game, because some of these games can have upward of 5 to 6 million registered users, and then systematically manipulate game parameters about the economy of the game, or about the political rules about when fighting happens. One of the problems that we have as political scientists is it's very hard for us to conduct experiments on things, even though we have an inherently experimental methodology in positive political science. If you were to try to conduct an experiment on any of the things that I study, well, first your human resource funding would be yanked, and then you'd probably be facing a war crimes tribunal, in that order. So these sorts of communities that you're talking about actually provide us with a remarkable opportunity to carry out some controlled experiments. And there are some economists who have already tried to study the effects of hyperinflation by looking at what goes on in these economies. I am not aware of anyone who has attempted to study terrorism yet, though that would be fascinating too. The communities that you point to, however, do raise an important thing to remember. Globalization is an inherently mixed bag. People treat it, like I just did there in a Freudian slip, as though it were all bad or all good, right? But the truth is, for any social group, just as globalization closes down certain options, it opens up other options, right? And so we have to move beyond asking, well, is globalization good or bad for that cause? And ask, how is it exactly that globalization facilitates certain sorts of behaviors but not others? And it's not at all clear to me that globalization will lead to less social capital formation. It may very well lead to more social capital formation through the formation of, larger venues for interpersonal exchange. Thank you.
Final, probably 3 to 5 minutes if there are questions for any of the remaining members of the panel in the room. Okay, if not, is anything? Okay. Well, if not, then I will return this program to Professor Reynolds. I hope you will all join us for the public lecture with Professor Amartya, the Nobel laureate, who will be speaking to us on violence and identity. So thank you very much. Please join me once again in appreciating the panel and with
I don't think this needs to go out, except that for those of you who may be following the video feed, it will come to an end until 12 o'clock. At 12 o'clock, the video feed will continue at Professor Sen's lecture. And of course, at 2 o'clock this afternoon, the video feed will resume here. 3 o'clock this afternoon. The video feed will resume here with our closing panel.